I just want to make a quick video about these bullshit propaganda pages. Um, you know, Republican girl in a liberal world. Okay, number one, we don't live in a liberal world. That's the problem. But these Republicans who watch Fox News and think they know something about politics are just so ignorant that they don't know what any of these terms or movements mean. Liberalism is the movement towards free markets. And right, what has happened is the socialists and the state interventionists and the people who lean on government power and want the feds, especially involved in every aspect of our lives, they have basically convinced everybody, including these idiot Republicans, that they are the liberals, when in fact their philosophy is the direct opposite of the historical liberal movement, and just etymologically it makes no sense, right? If we're liberals, we support liberty, we support individualism and property rights. So to take the historical movement of liberalism and even just like the basic vocabulary and history of the movement and the etymology of the term, state interventionists cannot logically be liberals. And so what they have done is they have packaged it up to where the Democrats, who are massive state interventionists, as well as the Republicans, of course, but the Democrats right now are parroting Adam Smith, right, against tariffs. Pretty much the first, quote, official treatise considered free market capitalism is Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, which is pretty much just debunking mercantilism and tariffs and everything else. So the logic then, of course, travels into or transfers over into migration regulation and minimum wage and the FDA, the ATF, everything. It's all the same logic, right? Liberalism is the move away from state power. And what they have, like I said, what they've done is they've got the Democrats repeating like a couple liberal positions in a mix mash of a whole bunch of other state intervention, and the Republicans, because they are nationalist collectivists who don't really understand any of this, they pick on the couple parts that actually are historical liberal capitalism, which is little to no laissez-faire trade controls. And they lean on this whole the founding fathers did tariffs and say, well, yeah, but they had practically no other taxes. That's the point. Like, we get to that first instead of slapping on 300% tariffs and all this other nonsense Trump is talking about. So that's what they've done with the propaganda. They've lumped it all together, just under authoritarianism, basically, and they piecemeal it out. And at this point, though, honestly, the Republicans have very little capitalist rhetoric, and Trump's administration has very little policies that actually reflect free market capitalism. And so basically it's just two sides of collectivists fighting over power, which it's interesting because the conservatives can see how that can kind of happen with the Nazis. They are somewhat clever enough to realize that just because Hitler killed other socialists and communists doesn't mean that he himself is not a socialist. And that happens in a bunch of other countries too, where factions of socialists fight each other for power. And so, but they're blind to the possibility that that could be, and in fact is what is happening right now, is that you just have two groups of collectivists fighting for power, and they're piecemealing out the propaganda to where, ironically, the Democrats actually have a couple more actual historical liberal capitalist positions, but it's just more just kind of like a knee-jerk reaction and propaganda from their point regarding the tariffs and the immigration control and such, because they don't actually believe in market capitalism anywhere else, really. I mean, the Marxists call them liberals because the Democrats aren't just outright totalitarian Marxists. They're more like, subversive, shadowy corporate fascists that just use the power of the state to steer industry in the way that they want. Same way the Republicans do and are doing now. And it's the Republicans are the ones who have more openly at this point leaned into using state power to manage the economy. Just because he doesn't outright nationalize everything 100% doesn't mean he's not a socialist or in that school of thought, right? Because his entire campaign is just trade controls and then a little bit of rhetoric about getting rid of the IRS and stuff, and but of course then he goes into the whole we're going to print money, we're going to lower the interest rate and all this. So it's just total nonsense, and it's frustrating to see this just constantly taken over. This is a smaller page, but somebody shared this in a group, and I was just like, what is this? Standard propaganda. Republican girl in a liberal world. Like we do. The problem is we do not live in a liberal world. Everyone, including and especially at this point, the MAGA-crats, have abandoned liberalism. They are all state interventionists. They all want the government to manage the economy through trade controls or through minimum wage or through welfare state. So, yeah, just mind blowing the level of propaganda that they've managed to to dupe everybody with. And it was obvious, of course, to libertarians and anarchists and stuff that the Republicans were collectivists because they've always loved the so-called immigration control, and they lean more heavily on that. Even though before Trump and even at the beginning of Trump, they at least thought in the terms of that, as a typical Marxist would, that these powers and these state controls are going to make things better in the future. They're going to balance out the playing field and whatever other nonsense magic thinking they've got going on in their mind. But at least they were still like using the rhetoric to where we do believe in free market capitalism, but this is just some short term things we got to do now. I mean, they don't even talk about that other than just basically repeating that they're capitalists. Yet they have no real grasp of what that means. Donald Trump is a businessman, so to them that's sufficient. If they support a businessman, that makes them supportive of capitalism, which of course is not. They of all people should know that some of the worst capitalists, some of the worst socialists are the big capitalists, and the big capitalists are so bad because they are essentially socialists. The one that they act like they want the state to help the workers, and well, we should have more taxes and all those types of nonsense arguments that they make. And whether they're sincere in those arguments and just misled, or if they know that they're duping people into supporting state power, is irrelevant. The outcome is the same, right? The worst capitalist is a socialist because they're the ones who want the state to so-called regulate the economy through patent, migration regulation, tariffs, all these other things to benefit, quote, the capitalists, which even, the socialists pick up on that, but they think that's capitalism when really it's state intervention that's the problem for, people, particular actors in society will use the state to benefit them. And if we have a nominally capitalist market system where the state doesn't just claim to outright own everything and manage everything, then sure, what you're going to end up with then is that the more powerful of the business people are going to, the authoritarian ones anyway, are going to try to use the state to limit competition for their benefit. But that's the problem with state intervention, right? Not capitalism as they call it. And the conservatives on the other end at this point have just leaned into state power, and yet somehow they think that's consistent with capitalism to have the state taking ownership in corporations and all of these bailout subsidies and everything else. That's not capitalism. There even was a point even just before Trump really got popular, and like I said at the beginning of it, where they kind of realized that was cronyism, as they used to call it. Crony capitalism was to use the state to subsidize and to tax and tariff and regulate other people out of business. But now that, as Trump is doing that, they're just supportive of it because they never really understood any of this. Clearly, you don't understand any of this if you are still using this nonsense propaganda where you're calling these Democrats and so-called Marxists liberals. And I mean, they call them liberal Nazis. Like, that doesn't even make any sense, right? Nazis hated liberalism for the same reasons that the MAGA-crats hate liberalism, was they viewed it as a way for the, quote, foreigner to come in and buy what they view as the nation's resources and steal, quote, the resources from the people of the nation. It's, that's why they hated free trade, and they support all these trade controls. So we see that on both sides, on all sides, they're all authoritarian collectivists, and it's just the Republicans are in power now. So I think that lends further weight to this type of nonsense propaganda. When you think that your team has won the day, it means to them, to the statists, since they all basically believe in ad populum, that means something, that your ideas are correct. They tend to think that popularity equals validity. And so that lends weight to these propaganda pages, just with repeating their nonsense terminology. Republican girl in a liberal world. We don't live in a liberal world. That is the problem. We live in a state collectivist world, and the MAGA-crats are pushing that even further. The Democrats would have loved to have gotten people to accept the state just claiming outright ownership of some percentage of any corporation. And Trump was the one who, in the sense of the Fabian socialists, he's the one who has now duped the conservatives to support basically socialist policies. And, a lot of us have been saying this for a while. Stossel even started making a couple reports on it, and, he's pretty, quote, normie libertarian journalist. He's great. I love him. But, right, it's good. I'm glad we've got a so-called normie finally, also saying this, which he's always been pretty cutting edge on information anyway, not necessarily his presentation, right? He tries to present it all, quote, moderate, and that may be just his personality or whatever. But in the end, right, he's always been really good on that. And thankfully, he is also now starting to call this fool a socialist because that's what he is. So yeah, we do not live in a liberal world. These people need to actually study the people that they pretend to believe in and support, because obviously they have never studied any free market capitalistic economics or liberal philosophy, because they would realize that the Republicans were the ones who thought they were the liberals, right? They supported small government, limited government, free market capitalism, at least rhetorically. Obviously, the politicians have not in policy in forever, basically, but at least their rhetoric was that. And now they've more or less abandoned it, and they don't even differentiate anymore. It's just we're living in a liberal world. Well, do you mean classical liberal, which really is nonsense anyway, because it's just liberalism? Clearly, they would you'd probably get them to say no, not a classical liberal world, but it's a liberal world. What's like, but that doesn't make any sense, right? If you're saying today is the opposite of the classical liberals, then clearly these people are not the liberal tradition. They have not carried the liberal tradition, and neither has MAGA. MAGA are authoritarian collectivist socialists. So, yeah, we do not live in a liberal world. You need to read your literature, friends, comrades.